All right, so today we are going to dive into a topic that has been all over the headlines, as you know.
Yeah.
Presidential immunity.
Right.
Can a former president be held accountable for actions taken in office? We are looking at the case against former President Trump, and specifically this motion filed by Special Counsel Jack Smith's office, kind of pushing back on these claims of immunity.
This motion is so pivotal because it's the prosecution directly responding to the Supreme Court, basically sending the case back down to the lower courts to figure out this whole immunity question. Where does it begin and where does it end?
And that's what is so fascinating about this document, right? It's like we're getting a sneak peek at how the prosecution is going to make their case.
Absolutely. And it's directly because of the Supreme Court's decision to send it back down, because they said even the evidence itself could be subject to immunity. So the prosecution is like laying it all out there meticulously.
Like really kind of preempting any arguments?
Yes.
So what jumps out at you in this first section where they're really building their argument? Like what's their main strategy?
So if the indictment was a summary, this motion is like the deep dive. They're going into granular detail, laying out all the evidence they plan to use, even stuff that's not mentioned in the indictment.
Wow. Okay. So they are really leaving no stone unturned. It's like, here's our argument, here's the evidence, and here's why it matters.
Precisely. And this ties directly into their central argument, which is that everything Trump is accused of wasn't part of his official duties as president. He was acting as a private citizen, a candidate trying to hold on to power, not the president actually like carrying out his constitutional duties.
Right. And they use this phrase that really stuck out to me as being crucial to their whole case.
Why?
Although the defendant was the incumbent president during the charged conspiracies, his scheme was fundamentally a private one. It's like they're drawing a line in the sand.
Absolutely. It's very calculated to make that distinction for the judge. This wasn't about governing, it was about winning.
So that leads to, I think, a question that's kind of at the heart of a lot of the discussions around presidential power in general. What does presidential immunity actually mean? It's not a get-out-of-jail-free card, right?
Yeah. No, though I'm sure some presidents wouldn't mind having one.
Right.
But the Supreme Court has outlined basically two main types of immunity. The first is what they call conclusive and preclusive authority.
Okay, unpack that for us. What does that even mean?
Basically, this is where the Constitution gives the president absolute power, like the pardon power.
Right.
If it falls under that type of authority, they can't be prosecuted for it.
So even if, hypothetically, someone thought a pardon was completely bogus, the courts couldn't touch it.
Yeah, essentially. Now, the second category is a bit more complex. This covers all the other official acts a president might take. And here, there's a presumption of immunity.
Presumption being the key word there.
Exactly, because the prosecution can argue against it. They have to prove that holding the president accountable would not harm the executive branch in any way or hinder their ability to carry out their duties.
So in this case, the burden of proof is on Trump to show why what he did was actually part of his job.
It's a huge distinction, and it circles right back to why the prosecution is being so meticulous in laying out all this evidence in this motion. They're trying to demonstrate that what he's being accused of doing was not official business, and thus not subject to this presumption of immunity.
Right. Which I guess leads to another question. How do we even define official presidential business? Where do you draw that line?
Yeah, that's where the legal wrangling comes in. This case really gets into the weeds of that. The courts typically look at the content, form, and context.
Content, form, context. Sounds a little like a law school exam question to me.
It does, but it's actually pretty straightforward. Basically, they want to break down what was said and done, how it was said and done, and under what circumstances. Was it about governing, or was it about campaigning? Was it about upholding the Constitution or personal gain?
So it's not just his actions, it's the motivations behind them.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's what makes this case so fascinating. It's pushing us to really examine like the very nature of presidential power and where the lines are drawn.
And the prosecution is using this framework then to kind of chip away at this idea that Trump should be granted immunity.
Yes, piece by piece.
Okay, so how do they apply this to the actual allegations against Trump? Where do they start to poke holes in his defense?
Well, let's start with one of the most pivotal moments, Trump's pressure campaign on Vice President Pence. This is where the prosecution gets really into the nitty-gritty, and we see the content form, context analysis really come into play.
Okay, this is where things get really interesting, so let's take a closer look. So we're back and ready to really unpack how the special counsel is using this content, form, context framework to directly challenge Trump's claims of immunity. And they really hone in on some very specific events.
Yeah, and I think they start with kind of the most high-profile one, which is this pressure campaign on Vice President Pence to try to get him to overturn the election results during the electoral vote count.
Right, this was huge news. How does the prosecution use this specific event to argue against Trump's immunity?
So they focus on a really crucial detail that, maybe was a little lost in the headlines at the time. But the executive branch, meaning the president, has absolutely no official role in certifying the electors.
Okay, so like zero constitutionally speaking?
Yeah, like zero. They have no role.
Yeah.
So just by trying to involve Pence in this way, they're saying Trump was already on shaky ground.
Interesting. So it's not like he was, asking Pence to sign a bill into law or something that's very clearly within the presidential purview.
Right, exactly. The content, form, and context all point away from this being an official act.
Yeah.
The content, pressuring the vice president to interfere with the electoral count.
That form.
These direct appeals, both public and private, to get him to do something he had no power to do. And then the context, obviously. A very contested election that Trump lost.
Right. It all kind of paints this picture of personal interest, not official duty.
Right, and that's what they're going for.
So it's like they're slowly chipping away at this wall of immunity, brick by brick, with all of these pieces of evidence. What other areas did they target? What else did they uncover that seems to contradict his claims?
Well, they also dig into Trump's contact with state officials after the election. Do you remember all those phone calls that were leaked to the press?
Oh, yeah, the ones where he's urging them to find enough votes to overturn the results in their state.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And again, the prosecution is so smart about this. They point out these tiny details that really undermine this idea that this was just a president, doing his due diligence. For one thing, they emphasize that he only reached out to officials in states that he lost.
Interesting. So not exactly a nationwide checking in on the electoral process kind of thing.
Yeah, it seems very targeted, right? And then it gets even more interesting. They highlight that he only contacted officials from his own party.
Okay. Yeah, that is definitely starting to feel less like governing and more like just trying to hold on to power by any means necessary.
Exactly. And that distinction is so crucial because when you look at the content, the form, the context, it's really hard to argue that these actions were driven by anything other than his own personal political motivations.
Which would put them firmly outside of the realm of presidential immunity if the prosecution is successful.
Right. And it gets even more interesting because they don't just stop with the phone calls. They even bring in the infamous tweets.
Oh boy, the tweets. I was wondering when those would come into play. But seriously, how can they use tweets as evidence to build a legal argument about presidential immunity?
Well, you know what they say, tweets are forever, right? And they can actually paint a pretty damning picture.
Yeah.
Especially when they're full of inflammatory language and calls to action.
And Trump's tweets were definitely not colorful, to say the least.
Yeah, to put it mildly. And so the prosecution really hones in on specific speeches and tweets, particularly those leading up to January 6th, as evidence that he was intentionally inciting his supporters and trying to interfere with the peaceful transfer of power.
So you're saying these weren't just, the off-the-cuff ramblings of a president with a Twitter habit. There was a deliberate strategy behind them.
That's exactly what they're arguing. They're presenting these tweets and speeches as very calculated attempts to sow distrust in the election process and to motivate his base to take action. And, when you look at the content of these messages in the context of everything else that was happening, it's hard to ignore the effect they likely had on, what happened on January 6th.
Right. It's one thing to, tweet about policy disagreements or to criticize your opponents, but it's quite another to use that platform to potentially incite violence.
Exactly. And that's where, again, content, form, and context become so important. A presidential tweet about a policy initiative, that's one thing. A presidential tweet urging supporters to, fight like hell to overturn the election results, completely different story. And it's that distinction that the prosecution is trying to make very clear.
It's amazing how they're building this case piece by piece, drawing from such a diverse range of sources. But I have to admit, I'm a little surprised that they would even attempt to use the president's own words, even if they were, blasted out in a late-night tweet storm against them in a court of law.
It is a bold move, for sure. But what's even more surprising is that they don't stop there. They even scrutinize his conversations with his own White House staff.
Wait, really? I mean, I understand how public speeches and tweets can be used as evidence, but private conversations with his own team, that seems like a whole other level. What could he have possibly said that would be considered not part of his job as president?
Well, it all comes back to that same line they've been drawing this whole time. Official duties versus personal gain. They argue that just because you're the president doesn't mean every conversation you have, even with your closest advisors, is automatically protected by immunity. They're really focusing on, you know, were these conversations about carrying out the constitutional duties of the presidency, or were they about using this position to advance his own personal political agenda, potentially to the point of breaking the law?
So hypothetically, if he was pressuring his staff to, I don't know, interfere with the Justice Department's investigation into the election, that would fall outside of this scope of protection?
Exactly. And that's where the prosecution's argument gets really interesting from a legal perspective. They're basically saying, look, the president's inner circle is not a free zone for criminal activity. If it was official business, they're probably in the clear. But if it was about furthering this personal agenda that might involve illegal activity, well, that's completely different.
This is all so fascinating, and it really underscores just how high the stakes are in this case. We've covered a lot of ground here, from pressure campaigns on the vice president to scrutinizing the content of late-night tweets. But the prosecution's argument extends even further, digging into the very heart of what it means to wield presidential power. And that brings us to what they argue is the ultimate consequence of Trump's actions. So we've really been digging into this idea of presidential immunity and how the prosecution is arguing against it in Trump's case. But what does this all mean in the grand scheme of things? Like, what are they hoping to achieve here beyond just building a case against one former president?
On the most immediate level, they're asking the judge to issue several specific rulings, most importantly, a confirmation that Trump can be tried on all the charges laid out in the indictment. None of it shielded by this immunity claim.
So basically a green light to proceed with the case as it stands, no special treatment for a former president.
Exactly. But I think the implications of this case really go way beyond just one man or one election. This has the potential to set a precedent that could completely redefine how we view presidential accountability going forward.
Okay, so now we're getting to the big picture stuff. This is where I need your expert analysis. What happens if Trump is actually found guilty? What kind of message would that send? Not just to him, but to every future president.
I mean, it would be monumental. Legally and historically, it would really establish without a doubt that presidents can't just claim blanket immunity for any action they took while in office, especially if those actions were for personal gain completely unrelated to their official duties.
So no more getting a free pass just because you happen to live at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue for a few years. That's a big deal.
Yeah, it would force future presidents to think twice, to be much more mindful of where the lines are drawn between their official duties and, their personal or political interests. It really emphasizes that no one, not even the most powerful person in the country, is above the law.
Wow, talk about a legacy. This case could end up in the history books right alongside Watergate and all those other times when we really had to redefine our understanding of presidential power.
It really could.
Yeah.
And it underscores this delicate balance that we have in our system between having a strong executive branch that can lead the country, but also having a system of checks and balances to prevent abuses of that power.
And that brings us back to this idea of precedent, right? If this case goes the way the special counsel is hoping, it sets a new standard for what future presidents can and cannot get away with.
Exactly. It's drawing a line in the sand, this far and no further. It reaffirms that the rule of law applies equally to everyone, regardless of their title or position.
It almost feels like this case is forcing us as a nation to really think about some fundamental questions, like, what do we expect from our leaders? What are the limits of power? How do we hold people accountable in a democracy?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a lot to process, and the outcome could really have ramifications for generations to come.
It really could. Well, this deep dive has definitely given us a lot to think about. We've gone from these dense legal documents to talking about potential historical shifts, and it seems like this story is very far from over. But what would you say, as someone who's spent their career studying these things, is maybe the most important takeaway for people to remember from all of this?
I think for me, it's just this reaffirmation that presidential power isn't absolute. It exists within this framework of laws and norms that are meant to protect our democracy. And when those boundaries are tested, it's up to the courts and ultimately up to the American people to hold our leaders accountable.
Perfectly said. Well, on that note, we will leave you with that thought to ponder. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the complexities of presidential immunity, and we'll be back next time with another fascinating topic ready to break it all down for you. Until then, stay curious.